Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. We're actually going to be starting a new series with this episode. I got pretty sick this past week, and I couldn't put all the time and effort into making one of these episodes that is really necessary. So I decided rather than uploading nothing, I was going to have a new sort of mini-series. The idea is that hopefully I'll be putting one of these out a week in addition to the series that I already have going. But regardless, episode 7, the final part of our cycle on the art series, is going to come out next week. So I'm thinking that hopefully we'll be able to put out one of these today and one of these on Sunday to sort of make up for that. But in this series, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at one topic in particular, and that is the Silk Road. So what is exactly the Silk Road? Well, when I spoke about Byzantium, we talked about how there weren't really any citizens back then that would have referred to themselves as Byzantines. They would have called themselves Romans. This is very similar to the idea of the Silk Road. This wasn't a nation or really even that large of an idea as much as it was different trade routes growing and expanding and meeting together and making bigger trade routes to sort of expand the economy of scale so that different items that had different values could go to where they were most needed. It allowed a lot of specialization, and it was also very influential in the transfer and innovation of various ideas. So the Silk Road basically was an avenue for trade from east to west, or what was referred to as from the Orient, the east, to the Occident, the west. There was a lot of flow of information that went back and forth that we'll take a look at, but we're going to, at this point, say that there were some trade networks in the west, and there were some trade networks in eastern Central Asia, and then there were some in the Far East, and they all expanded on their own time until they reached each other and then sort of interlocked. It was a necessary webwork of trade commodities interlocking into larger trade routes. Now, what do I mean by this? We took a look in an episode at what it took to make bronze, which needed copper and tin, which are both pretty rare elements. In order to meet the need to get those tools, you would first have to have other trade routes under your belt. One of the most important would be wood. Not just any wood, though. You would need large trees that you could form single planks from for your ships, because back then that was sort of the only way they really knew how. Trade routes are very interesting. They encourage the intermingling of different societies without necessarily conflict. What do I mean by this? War spreads culture, probably more often than not historically, but the Silk Road is one of those really interesting cases where a lot of ideas were spread by innovation, by settlers, by traders, and by people who weren't carrying the sword. When maintained, trade routes, international trade routes specifically, could actually benefit all member nations involved rather than just the individual groups the way that a war would. So if you were Egypt and you wanted to go to war against Assyria to take their resources, you would then lose that valuable trading partner, whereas if you decided to trade with them, you could both exist, you could both innovate, and you could both become better than either one of you could if the other stopped existing. So I mentioned that the Silk Road was really an amalgamation of a bunch of smaller trade routes that as they expanded, came into contact with each other and became more fruitful by linking in. I want to take a look at some of the basic trade routes in the West that helped lead the Mediterranean area towards the Silk Road. The first one that I really want to take a look at that is really not well understood today, as you'll see why, is timber. Like I said, they had very good ships in the ancient Egyptian and Phoenician days. They had double-decked ships and triple and so on. They would have oarmen to manually row at the same time that they also used sails. It wasn't very effective in deep water, but they managed to stay near the coast. They could even go from Eastern Africa to the Gulf region. And there was a lot of idealization and a lot of innovation in the shipbuilding of the time, but this was because they had great timber reserves. If you look at the country Lebanon and you take their flag, there's this great green tree right in the middle of it. Now today when we think of Syria and Israel and Palestine and all of these regions that we now know as the Levant, and that we then knew as the Levant, we think of it as arid and dry and not all that well covered by trees. This simply wasn't the case for a lot of history. There's several ancient records of Egyptian pharaohs calling for the cedars of Lebanon to be made into ships. These are very big, very old trees. There's still a few hundred of them in Lebanon, but not nearly as many as used to exist. They take a really long time to grow. They don't take that long to cut down, and unfortunately, Bronze Age man was very terrible to his environment, as most Bronze Age societies today are, with cut and burn tactics for whole forests and things like that. So we have this image of North Africa and the Levant of being arid and without trees, and this simply wasn't true at the time. One major trade route that existed back then was for lumber from the Levantine coast and from North Africa in particular. These areas are near deserts, and one unfortunate side effect of removing foliage from an area near a desert is that plants hold the soil down. When you take the plants away, the soil can get blown around. When the topsoil leaves because of wind erosion, the rest of the dirt becomes less fertile, meaning less plants will be there, meaning the desert expands. We'll look at that a little bit more in a little bit, but that's sort of a basic idea of where we got to our current geography in those two regions. Another very important trade route at the time, up until 200 years ago, 1808, was the slave trade. Now, we have an idea of the triangle slave trade, but it's not really looked into a whole lot where that came from. The triangle slave trade was really a continuation of the Islamic slave trade. The Islamic slave trade was a continuation of the Roman slave trade, and the Roman slave trade was a continuation of the Egyptian slave trade. So I talked previously about how nomads would traffic all kinds of livestock and chattel slaves and all kinds of other things as resources for trade and for exploitation of the more agriculturally based civilizations around them. There were a few groups, the Tuaregs were one notable example that still kind of exists today, that have had ancient passage through the Sahara to West Africa for thousands of years. They would take product from the Mediterranean, cross these secret paths in the Sahara to West Africa, and trade them for slaves, which they would bring back to the regions, because generally people don't actually like to have their own people in bondage. It's some sort of mental thing where it's easier to accept, I suppose you could say, if they look different from you. And this case has been true for almost all of history. Another very important trade route, I'm sorry about that, guys, is ceramics. Now, ceramics is another one that needs to be explained, because today we think of pots and pans, use them for cooking. They're not really the same kind of magnitude that they once were. If you've ever lost everything in a fire or a move or something like that, you might notice that the objects that you hold and the things you have around you do a lot to remind yourself of who you are and what you think. People don't put bumper stickers on their cars to communicate with other people. They put bumper stickers on their cars to communicate with themselves. In the same way, if you were in a peasant village in Bronze Age Egypt, Bronze Age Greece, Bronze Age Mesopotamia, not where the rich people lived, where the average person lived, you'd be living in something made from mud and straw and very simple bricks, and it would all look the same except for the industry around you. So the pots that you have, the vases that you would use to hold your grain and your oils, all those kinds of little things would help to remind you, along with your language and your religion, that you were part of a separate group, and it would help to sort of root the idea of your people and your group in a way that sort of blends, like we'll see when we talk later about the Hellenistic age. There was a lot of blending in these different cultures, and a lot of people stopped seeing why exactly they should be governed by this group or that group when everybody seemed to be the same anyways. So ceramics had, one, the effect of storage, which was very useful for people who needed to store things for long times, but it also gave you a sense of belonging and a sense of culture, even if you weren't on a grand scale. And then finally, the last, one of the most important trade routes was bronze. As we discussed, if you were in Egypt, you were pretty far away from copper, you were very far away from tin. In order to get that tin, you would have had an effective timber industry, you would have had an effective lumber yard, you would have had slaves already, so that's why this one's at the end. I already talked about this one extensively in a video, so I'm going to sort of leave it at that, but these were the four most important and basic trade routes in the ancient West: timber, slaves, ceramics, and bronze. So, as trade becomes more necessary, it's required to send more traders, and obviously this is an area where competition could first come to mind, but this was a very dangerous time. There was all kinds of slavers and raiders and pirates and foreign nations that may want to mess with trade, and a single merchant with a single boat can't carry as much as 5 merchants with 5 boats. So out of a sort of necessity, traders began to move together in larger crowds for various reasons, and they began to coalesce into trade hubs. Now, when I say trade hubs, I mean larger cities that were generally palaces in the ancient palace economy that filtered or sort of drew trade towards themselves and then out towards another one. This facilitated large trade movements and large trade for various traders that were traveling the Silk Road. Some examples of these trade hub cities would be Alexandria, Persepolis in Iran, Athens in Greece. These areas would be necessary stopping points for unloading and reloading cargo. And so let's take a little look at why traders would have needed to band together and why this would have been good for the nations that they passed through. So the first is scarcity. Of course, everything is scarce. We live in a scarce universe. Everybody knows that. But this was very different back then. One way to think about it is Disneyland is down in Florida today, right? And there's not really another one as you go further north. So if you go buy some merchandise in Disneyland and you go all the way up to New York, you could probably sell it for a little bit more than you could at Disneyland. Don't try that. I don't think that's legal, but that's just to illustrate a point. So basically, if you were in Egypt and you had Egyptian ceramics, or if you were in Persia, let's say, and you had Persian limes, the further away from the center of production you could move, the more money you could make from the sale. That's for a couple of reasons. One is obviously risk. In Greece, where in the early Bronze Age they wouldn't have had any contact with any sort of citrus, if you brought a bag of them from Persia, nobody had seen it, it would be a totally new kind of food. It would generate a lot of buzz, I guess you could say, and it would be far more valuable than if you were trying to sell a bag of limes underneath a lime tree in Persepolis. So scarcity played a very big role, not necessarily that the items themselves were scarce, but you needed to move the items to an area of low scarcity to be able to make money, which necessitated safe travel. So the second one would be safety. Traders needed a sense of safety, or else they never would have invested in any sort of trading exploits to begin with. So if it costs lots of money and years of your life to make this trade, and there's a 90% chance that pirates are going to get you and all of your stuff, you're probably not going to go. So if you are taking a lot of wealth from, let's say, Persia again, to Greece to sell those oranges, you'll need to go that whole distance, but you also need to come back. And this necessity of safe travel both ways encouraged the Greeks and the Persians alike to want to open up those trade avenues, because it's not enough to just make it halfway. If you want your society to be encouraged by the growth of those who are willing to trade and willing to take risks, then you need them to be able to be safe on that trip. So lots of merchants would either be state-sponsored, meaning that they would carry seals and soldiers with them so that the state sort of had a say in whether or not they could be harmed along the way, or they would move in large groups together of the thousands, because if a pirate ship comes up with 20 or 30 guys and you have 5,000 merchants, it doesn't really matter if they're a whole lot better with a sword than you are. You have a lot more swords than they do. And the last reason why traders really started banding together at this time would be security. If your merchants aren't secure on their trade routes and other people's merchants aren't secure on your trade routes, guess where no merchants are going to go? That means that you're not going to have those new ideas, those new products, those new innovations coming toward you. They're going to be going towards someone else. So at a time when trade and innovation were sort of small and they took place on a scale between large cities, palace economies, you wanted to drag that towards your civilization and towards your capital and your trading hub by making it as safe as possible. Egypt didn't really engage in a whole lot of warfare in their ancient times because they didn't need to. If it was safe to come to Egypt, people would. There was wealth, there was trade, there was all sorts of reasons to be there. Their real big deal was making it safe, and that was one reason why they became such a conduit for creativity and innovation. So again, why did the traders band together into these large trading routes, which later came to form the Silk Road? It was because of scarcity, it was because of safety, and it was because of security.